Good evening, and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement team at the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at CPL, welcome. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. I would like to thank the Chicago Public Library staff who worked to make this event possible. Books are available for purchase in the back of the room, and the author will sign books at the conclusion of the program. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience from those who line up at the microphone in front of stage. And virtual viewers, please put your questions in the chat. Tonight, Chicago Public Library is pleased to welcome journalist Mary Annette Pember to discuss her new book, Medicine River, A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. Mary Annette Pember is an independent Ojibwe journalist focusing on Native American issues. She has reported on the high rates of sexual assault experienced by Native women, sex trafficking, health, the impact of historical trauma on Native communities, and environmental challenges on Native lands, federal policy issues, and cultural topics. Her work has appeared in Indian Country Today, Rewire News, Truth Out, Yes Magazine, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Color Lines, The Atlantic, and many others. She is past president of the Native American Journalists Association and is based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her new book, Medicine River, was inspired by her mother's experience being forced to attend an Indian boarding school in Wisconsin. The book paints a stark portrait of communities still reckoning with the legacy of this tragedy that has affected generations of Native communities, as well as the evolution and continued rebirth of a culture whose country had been seemingly intent upon destroying it. Mary will be in conversation with Dr. Doreen Weesey. Dr. Doreen, White Earth Ojibwe enrolled and descendant of the Oneida, Seneca, Dakota, and Brotherton nations, is the founding president of the American Indian Association of Illinois and CEO, Professor Emeritus of NAES College. She has served as a professor of American Indian Studies courses at Eastern Illinois University and the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. She is the artistic director for the Black Hawk Performance Agency, the Performance Company, the Chicago American Indian Museum Without Walls, the Chicago Native Leadership Academy, and Native Scholars Youth Media Dream Team. In 2022, she was recognized as a leader for New Chicago by the Field and MacArthur Foundations, and she's a great friend of the Chicago Public Library. Please join me in welcoming Mary and Doreen to the CPL stage.
We're so happy to be here with you this evening. Glad you came out. This is a wonderful opportunity. We don't get that many Native authors in Chicago, and we're just so excited to have you here, Mary. And we love this. We love your book. It's so timely in terms of the boarding school issues, and certainly we've never had anybody write about them as close to Illinois and Minnesota and that's where I'm from, White Earth, Minnesota, as you have. And Wisconsin, there's so many Ojibwe people. I didn't really realize how many tribes there were in Canada, and us. We're actually the second largest tribe in the United States, the Ojibways, because we're everywhere. But I wanted to start by thanking you, and then I thought my first question would be, why did you write this book?
I'm going to do my little
You wanna
tight 200 words here. Boju Gakino Wia, Baba Monaquit, Indigenous Kaz, Mong and Dudem. Chimagwich to Doreen and to the Chicago Public Library for having me. And Chimagwich, thank you very much to everybody for coming out on such a beautiful day to spend in this dark theater. I always like to speak my mother's language, Ojibwe-Wampanoag, when I can. I'm not a fluent speaker, but I often think my mom would have been just so shocked and gratified that I would be speaking Ojibwe in front of fancy groups of people at the library and so on. You know, she attended the sister school they called it, at St. Mary's Catholic Indian Boarding School in Odena on the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin. So speaking Ojibwe is like a real act of triumph and vindication for me. While she was at the sister school, she was forbidden to speak Ojibwe Wabamin and was often beaten for doing so. Rather, she learned to be ashamed of all things Ojibwe, language, culture, and ethnicity. The Franciscan nuns, the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, called her and the other students dirty Indians. Their mission was to convert, assimilate, and civilize, eradicating all that was native about the children in the process. Medicine River shines a light on the history of Indian boarding schools told through my search for the true story of my mother's life and the personal reckoning with how my family and I survived. The book is an intimate and global examination of the nature of oppression, how it occupies not only society and culture, but also one's soul and sense of self. But more importantly, in Medicine River, I describe one of the world's greatest stories of cultural survival and resilience, how Native peoples have protected and passed on our ways in order to give descendants like me a way forward. So that's my little tight 200 words that I used to introduce. I wanted to just preface, Doreen and I have known each other many years. My family, like a lot of Ojibwe from Wisconsin and Minnesota, frequently came down Chicago, as we called it, on buses or trains. And when I was a girl, we would come and visit my aunts and uncles, and I thought it was the most fabulous, sophisticated place I'd ever seen in my entire life. I used to love to come down here. We would take a train and arrive at that magnificent depot. And, and they had, like, for some reason, I don't know why I was obsessed with this as a child, I was obsessed with the vending machines they had. They just had, like, banks of vending machines, and they had things in the vending machines that you couldn't imagine, like apples and all these outlandish things, and I always wanted to buy them. My mother always refused. So Ojibwe have a lot of experience and memories associated with Chicago. I remember the old apartments, the walk-ups, with the rickety back fire escapes made of splintery wood, and going out on Sunday mornings with my dad and my Uncle Jack. For some reason, men always went to the tavern after Sunday Mass, and I remember my cousin Scott and I would tag along. So it's really, this is the last leg of my book tour today and tomorrow, and it feels really fitting that I should end it here because this has been such a special place to me. Doreen has just done incredible things in the community and is such a storehouse of knowledge and history. I was telling her she needs to write about that because the story of Chicago in Native people's lives in the United States looms large. Almost everyone, as Doreen mentioned, has a Chicago story. Almost every Native person does, and I encouraged her to take advantage of that wealth that she has of knowledge and history. So why did I write Medicine River? Well, I've kind of always been writing Medicine River, to be honest with you. When I was a girl, my mother told me what I've come to call the sister school stories. At night, we would lay in bed and visit. I was the youngest and the only girl. And Ojibwe women in particular have a really strong bond with their daughters. And maybe that was the reason that she chose me to whom to tell these stories. In the sister school story, she figured as a sort of like a heroine, who survived the cruelties of the Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, and the other nuns, almost like a Cinderella kind of character. And I often had envisioned her as like Shirley Temple and Little Miss Marker or something. But later, I started learning more about the truth and how those things really hurt her and impacted her. But they've always been a part of my life. And I think in looking back that she chose me for a number of reasons. One, because I was the girl, but also I think she was at a time in her life when she was safe. And she was safe enough to really risk telling these stories. And I think in general, we have to be safe before we can revisit some of our past. especially things that caused us a great deal of pain. My father had started a little business, and they did pretty well. He was a dental technician. He made false teeth. And they did, well enough that they bought a little house. And so we had that house in Janesville, Wisconsin, and I think she felt she had arrived, and she felt safe enough to tell me all of these stories. And they became like, she sort of set me on this quest, as it were, to tell her story and to expose the hypocrisy, under which she lived, which always stuck in her craw, even though she, became a church lady, essentially. Because that was really the only choice in her life, really. That was the achievement. That was the way to earn respect. And from my mother's perspective of a kid, during the Depression, whose parents had split up and were essentially in danger of starving, they were placed into the sister school because, her grandparents didn't have enough eats to go around, as they said, and so they placed them there. And the nuns often really reminded them, one, that they were receiving charity, and that because they were dirty Indians, their families weren't capable of raising them and parenting them in a good way. So that was a really painful thing for my mother, in some ways more painful than the beatings that she often received. Their discipline was very harsh. She talked about, for instance, seeing this beautiful apple in the cellar where they stored food, and she stole it and ate it, and she received a terrible beating, but somehow it was worthwhile to eat this apple. But that was never as painful as being reminded that a priori, as a person, she and Native people were bad. They were wrong. They needed to get rid of who they were and reinvent themselves as white servants, essentially. To be trained to join civilization, but only, again, as servants, not as they weren't training people that went to boarding schools in those days to be attorneys or, to be doctors and so on. They were training them to do housework or farm work. And there was a great emphasis on that, on work. So my mother often told me during the sister school stories about these white donors, women who would come to see the little Indians, and they would, donate old clothing and like old candy and money, of course, and the nuns would fawn over them. And my mother hated those women, yet she was determined that she would win the same respect in her life that these women got from these nuns, and just in general, I think. And she was able to achieve that amazingly, but it held so much ambivalence for her. She could never really be joyful in it. It was, as I said, it stuck in her craw. And as a kid, she sent me to Catholic school, only me, she didn't send my brothers. And I would try to do, I would try to be, the dutiful Catholic kid. But she would disparage me because of it. So it was a very confusing message to get as a child. But I always knew that I would tell her story. It was just sort of ingrained and later thrown down like as this gauntlet before me that I would do this. And it took a while, but I finally did it.
Wow, it's just such an amazing story that you were, too. I love in the book how you intertwine all of this history and that really brought us up to that period, to the boarding school period, and then the laws and how it really started from the very beginning, from contact, where the goal was really to Christianize Native people. Well, that was after they first. It was really about just destroying us completely. But then the shift. When did that shift really? When people started thinking, well, maybe if we could change them, if we could make them white, then some could survive. When do you think that really started to happen?
Well, even initially they did. I mean, there was, a papal bull, which is part of really that comprised the doctrine of discovery. I think they eventually did determine, the Catholic Church, that Indians had souls. So, that was useful. That was something that they could take and to pillage, if you will. They often talked about a zeal for souls. So I think, they were after not only our bodies, but also our souls, and of course what we owned. We were really seen as the ultimate commodity on every level. But I think it was after the Civil War that the federal government really very pointedly began using assimilationist policies like boarding schools to as a means to incorporate Native people into mainstream culture. Although, I think it's a mistake, however, if we take boarding schools out of those assimilationist policies as a separate consideration, because it's all part of this continuum, really, very much. When we look at, after the Civil War, removal, allotment, which in many ways cannot be underscored as or underrated as the impact it had on Native people, in many ways greater probably than boarding schools, because it separated people from their lands and their ways of life and feeding their children and so on, and that had a devastating impact on people. It impoverished them, and so both just physical impoverishment and spiritual impoverishment as well, and then the children as well. So those three things together, especially I think after the Civil War, I often think of as this triple whammy that happened, in this very short period of time after the Civil War, like 30 years, all of this stuff really came together in this incredible force of targeting Native culture and language. If they could get rid of that, they felt, they would really have a shot of incorporating us into their culture as servants. So I think that kind of, and of course, Lieutenant Pratt, Richard Pratt, who was the founder of Carlisle, is credited with the kill the Indian to save the man. And that sort of came about, I think, during this era of growing progressivism, when the American public has sort of lost a taste for like outright extermination of an entire population of people. It was felt that it would be more humane, if we get to stamp out their culture and then re-educate them and, reuse us, as it were, repurpose us. So in the time, it was really seen as a very humane alternative. And Lieutenant Pratt was, he was a really kind of loquacious guy. He was out and about, proclaiming this agenda that he had. He had a great deal of support from like industrialists in the East and church, leaders in the church community and the Christian community. So he had a lot of support for this, and the federal government, I think, saw it as like a really good alternative, as I said, to killing us all off.
Definitely, even though by the turn of the century, the data that you had and I had, the data, the numbers are even lower. How many people were left, how many American Indians were left, were very few. I think the last number you had was 239,000 at the turn of the century. So you can imagine that's been debated how many of us were here in the beginning, but definitely it was millions. And Henry Dobbins from the Newberry came up with millions, and so that continued. And then also this not only the boarding schools, you mentioned there started a proliferation of orphanages and asylums and other places where that we could be placed, and that's still happening today. I mean, I actually know people that were in an orphanage right up on Ridge Avenue in Devon, Native people, and they tell those stories. And then today, St. Mary's is still a place. It was a small boarding school, but it is still, as for years, has been a place where where children are sent in foster care. So that has never ended. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes. I mean, many people have made comparison to, what has driven the Indian Child Welfare Act. A lot of our people were removed in the 60s. Catholic Charities removed a great deal of people around the Great Lakes area, a great deal of children. So, it's always sort of been that we are not capable of, the message has been that we are not capable of raising our own children. And again, this whole commodification, if you will, of our children and our bodies and our land. But the thing, and of course it's like, oh God, Indians are like the gold standard for despair in this country. It's like, oh, the poor Indians, they've done all these terrible things to them. And yeah, they have done a lot of terrible things to us. But we are the great, I'll think of Native folks as the great inventors, the great scientists. We have always responded to our environment and recreated ourselves when necessary. And that is what science is, really, what scientists do. It's, observation-based. And we were always, I think, changing and adding or discarding things that worked or didn't work for us. And as people began going to boarding schools, it's like, well, this is what's happening to us. And, generations of people began attending, and they figured out ways to turn the power and to survive and then even to flourish in ways, very innovative ways. People met their spouses at boarding schools. People would hide and conduct, and speak their language and conduct ceremony. People, would go to the school. Maybe there would be other people from their community there, or even family members. So people did, gathered together and survived in really strong ways. And I think that's one of the things that I just found really inspiring about doing the research for this book.
That's so true, and I don't think we tell enough stories about the survival of our parents and grandparents. I was looking, research is so fun, and I was looking up some research on my family and found I had an uncle that a great uncle that went to prison for bootlegging. And I had heard stories, my grandma bootlegged too. So it was like, this was a way to make some money, and it wasn't, you could actually make like dandelion wine from, plants. It was, they viewed, I think, as harmless. It was really before, I think, drinking really took hold on, in a greater way where, we get to the 50s, 60s, everyone drank to an excess. But I think that, and then the schooling is always fascinated me because unlike people, immigrants and refugees today, or even white families, our schooling was forced on us. So our parents looked at it in a different way. My mother went to boarding school, and my grandmother, both my grandmothers, but I don't know my grandmother's stories. I know where they went, but that's about all I know. So it's amazing to me that it was good that they learned to read and write, because the other thing about, in our past, let's say the treaties of Illinois, the people that negotiated these treaties were really people that were mostly white who could read and write. So many people on them had signed with an X. So they couldn't read or write. So that was really the first obstacle that really helped a lot of people be able to rebuild their lives, was reading and writing. So did your mom talk much about the actual schooling, or did she receive any schooling at all in the boarding school where she went?
She didn't talk much about it, and I don't think they received a lot. It was a big emphasis on work, big emphasis on cleaning. In particular, I think these nuns, many of whom were like German or French, so there was, cleanliness was a big deal. And my mother really focused on that, and the boys worked in the farm. However, she liked to read. My mother did like to read. And actually, reading was one of the ways that Lieutenant Pratt was able to convince people in the plains, some of the chiefs out in the plains, to send their kids. Because he had said, well, if you guys could read English, you might not have gotten such a short end of the stick on these treaties. And, well, yeah, they agreed. I mean, Native people I don't think have ever been averse to education. However, we have been averse to having our language and our cultures totally destroyed. But I don't think that people were necessarily averse to it. It was just the way that it was done to us. It wasn't really presented to us and delivered to us as a way to expand our worldview and so on. However, people did. I mean, people really got behind a lot, like these civics lessons, for instance, that they would teach you in school. Now, that's something Indian people could support. Due process, the Constitution, equality, and the vote. I was able to find out this wild story about my grandma. Actually, sometimes I do a little reading. If you guys want, I can just read, and this is absolutely true, about my grandmother. And I was doing research. It was late at night. My eyes were burning from hours of staring at the tiny print when the name Cecilia Rabideau grabbed my attention. Initially, I thought my tired eyes were deceiving me. Here was the name of the woman my mother hated, the bad mother who abandoned her children at the sister school. With little in the way of legal, economic, or social protection for Indian women in those days, Seal was placed in an untenable moral impasse, physical survival or motherhood. She chose survival. My mother never forgave her and seldom spoke her name. Seal married a white man named Herschel and started a new family. She died in 1956, a year before I was born. I knew little about Grandma Seal except that she was loud and profane and baked excellent pie. Uncle Russell, my mother's half-brother, confirmed this. He recalled sitting at the table with Seal and the family when their father, Herschel, began choking on one of her pies. Still angry at Herschel's previous night's drunkenness, Seal shrieked at him, "Choke then, you son of a bitch." I was surprised to see Cecilia Rabideau described as a responsible woman and chair of the local League of Women Voters during a 1926 floor debate in the House of Representatives regarding the corrupt judicial practices of Bureau of Indian Affairs reservation superintendents. Seal had written to James Freer, representative for Wisconsin 10th District, for help, describing how her brother Paul was arrested without warrant or due process and jailed 70 miles away from the Bad River Reservation on the Lac de Flambeau Reservation. Like many Indian people during that era, Paul was arrested and incarcerated at the whim of a reservation superintendent. As part of the Code of Indian Offenses enacted in 1883, government reservation agents appointed Indian judges to enforce their judgments against Indian citizens. Typically, judges were paid $10 per month and almost always supported the agents' agendas. Agents and native workers for reservation projects, for instance, often simply arrested people and forced them to work as part of their sentence. According to the record, Uncle Paul and some friends were partying with some women on the Lac de Flambeau Reservation. One of the women was later found to be in, quote, a delicate condition, unquote. She named Paul as the culprit. As a result, the judge issued an order for Indian police on the Bad River Reservation to arrest and transport Paul to Lac de Flambeau. Grandma Seal took the train to Lac de Flambeau and confronted the superintendent, insisting she be allowed to see her brother. She found him languishing along with several other Indian men and women in a tiny, filthy jail cell with a ball and chain fastened to his ankle. Eventually, Wisconsin's Governor John Blaine carried Seal's protest all the way to President Calvin Coolidge. Afterward, Uncle Paul was permitted to escape. As a result of Seal's intervention, Uncle Paul walked free. In her sworn, notarized testimony, Seal reported she'd asked the police in Bad River to produce a warrant for Paul's arrest. When the white government farmer, who occasionally acted as community police officer, told her one wasn't needed, she asked, "How is that?" How did Seal, a 24-year-old Ojibwe woman with less than a 9th grade education, know about due process? In civics class at the sister school, Seal learned about this most fundamental guarantee of the U.S. Constitution, the Due Process Clause, which provides that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. America in the 1920s was a turbulent age for Indians and women, a time in which long-accepted social and economic norms were undergoing marked transformations. Women and newly educated Indians, keen to reap the rewards of the American promise of equality, boldly challenged long-standing traditions surrounding race and gender. Seal was in the middle of it all. She was an 18-year-old single mother in 1920 when women gained suffrage. Not long afterward, in 1924, Native Americans were declared citizens of the United States. Greater surprises about Seal came later. According to the archives of the Wisconsin League of Women Voters, the village of Odena on the Bad River Ojibwe Reservation is the birthplace of the first Indian League of Women Voters, established in October 1924. Ellen Penwell, membership and events manager of the League of Women Voters, sent me links to the organization's original newsletter, Forward. Most stirring to the imagination is the recent report of the formation of the first Indian League of Women Voters, composed of 86 women of the Odena tribe of Wisconsin. In Odena, there is a band of serious, thoughtful women who are just as interested in having everything right for their children as we are for ours. They want the right to be heard in court on the same terms as the white race. They want a doctor, a home for the old people. They want a voice in the village government that they might improve the condition under which they have to live. Although Seal isn't named in the 1929 forward article, and the tribal affiliation of those founders of the first Indian League of Women Voters is incorrectly listed as the Odena tribe, she was almost certainly one of the band of serious, thoughtful women described there, as evidenced by the statement to Congress. It was the work of Indian women such as Seal and members of the Indian League of Women Voters who aided in forwarding the Howard Wheeler Act of 1934, which ended federal allotment of Indian lands and stressed self-governance. So Seal, she didn't graduate from sister school. I did find a listing of her name on the roster, and they had, the little category for the person's name and this pre-printed form, the tribal affiliation, the year they entered, and then if they graduated or left. And she had left, and the reason for leaving, the sister wrote, no good reason. So she must have gotten ticked off, or who knows why she left, but she just left. And that seems like, my editor said, wow, how could it be anything else, So, this is something that I found, and what was so interesting about this, I flew out to Idaho to talk with my Uncle Russ. There's very few people remaining today who remember her, and he knew absolutely nothing about this. I just randomly came across it, in my research. And nobody in Bad River knew anything about this either. So I'm often struck with how poignant it is, though, that she was very interested in social and political justice, as my mother was, but they never got to share that. It was the policies, the fallout from that was occurring in Indian country at the time. Just it destroyed their relationship, and I just find that really poignant.
That's so inspiring that you found that.
I know,
because
I
I
can't
think
believe it.
we always are looking for someone in our family that did something good. Usually people don't want to tell their family stories because they have so much trauma and tragedy. So when you find something good, it's just amazing to me. And that those are the stories we need to know, is that, to demonstrate that our people are strong and resilient. Though it's not, when I think about being strong and resilient, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be famous. I think we don't appreciate motherhood, and you think about people in those days, they would have 8, 10, 12 children. That's just so hard. And I can see your grandma left your mom, and she just couldn't cope with how would she take care of the children. And you see that a lot. And I like one thing you wrote in the book about how really even today boarding schools have become like the daycare center of last resort. And we've seen that now in this modern day. Even I have a friend who, and we both said our childhood was so bad, we would have, if we knew that we could have gone to boarding school, we would have went ourselves. But we didn't know. No one we knew had gone, so we didn't know how to get there, or we just didn't know what to do that. But it's different. It's changed. I think it changed in terms of where people went when they're now. You said there's only 90 left, and so that there's so few, and probably today there's even fewer than that. But so that people look at them different, and they're not really studying the history, because also there's one researcher said to you, because he insinuated, it wasn't that bad. It was tough love.
Yes.
I like that.
I couldn't believe that. Sometimes people will say these things, and you're like, I'm writing this down. I can't believe these kinds of things. But he didn't even really see, the irony of that. Native people did use boarding schools to survive. They did. Particularly during the Depression. It was, starvation was, the chance of that was very real. And then later, as well, people often didn't have resources, even after the Second World War. And I think Bad River, when you look at, some of the records and some of the history, there were not a lot of jobs available, and people had to leave. People had to send their children somewhere. And you speak with some survivors, although they may not have really enjoyed their boarding school experience, it was better than home. There were some people who were in these terrible situations at home, where maybe the parents were, suffering from addiction of various things, or very poor, which of course doesn't make it any better of a choice, but at least in ways did offer physical survival. And people, as I said earlier, people supported each other a lot. And I was so struck with how people were able to, usually through humor, they would make fun of everything, like attach these crazy nicknames to the nuns and to the teachers. My mother told me, for instance, that, many of these nuns, for them, English was a second language. They had arrived from Germany or from France, and the children found if they could speak Pig Latin really fast, the nuns couldn't understand them. So they would say these outrageous things to the nuns.
Right, they found ways to cope, and if it wasn't for the violence, they did learn. They had that support from each other. I mean, that's what a lot of stories of people that I've worked with talk about. But they do mention the violence, and how sometimes even the nuns got the students to be violent against each other. And I have one friend, she lived her whole life from the age of 5 also in a boarding school in South Dakota, and but she felt that it prepared her for life in the when she grew up, and she came to Chicago and she had learned how to type in boarding schools, and then that gave her a career that she could then pursue here. But I think some of the things that are most moving about your book are really about how you wanted to know really what made your mother the way she was, because there were some things that were difficult about her, and that you do feel that the writing this book has resolved that for you.
Well, things are never resolved, really, right? I mean, it certainly has given me a lot of understanding and some authority over what happened to my mother. I think we all think our parents are just put on earth to raise us and to take care of us, and we don't really see them as other people. And I think, I was really wanting to interrogate, some of the reasons she was the way she was. She was a cipher, and she would just probably in reaction to some kind of a trigger, a quality of light, a sound, a smell, and she would just become really upset or agitated or angry, and we had no idea why. And she would often, I was often the brunt of her anger. So it was so difficult to understand as a child. And, after a period of time, I felt as I really wanted to know, what had happened to her to create this in her. And I'll just share a little bit of an anecdote that I do also write about in the book. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I've been sober since the year 2000. And during my I drank over her. I drank over everything because I'm an alcoholic, right? And we don't really need that much of a reason, but there was a lot of unresolved stuff I had with my mother that fueled it, and I would complain about her in the rooms of AA quite often. And I got a sponsor, and I don't know if people know about AA. The way it works is, there's no official leadership, but, you usually will seek out another member who has more sobriety than you, and that person will offer you their experience, strength, and hope. So my sponsor instructed me, when I was complaining so much about my mom, she instructed me to pray for her. And there would just to be no specifics about these prayers, just that she would have peace. So I started praying for her. And during this time, my mother was starting to get dementia. She was getting older, and she would just do these crazy things. She would leave in her little car, and she'd be gone for 2 days. And then we'd get a call from somebody 1,000 miles away. Some good Samaritan would find her, and we'd have to walk her back home. And she was always convinced we were stealing from her. We were stealing all her money. And by this time, the money that she had really comprised this collection of state quarters that she kept displayed in this these cardboard slots in this display in her room. But she was convinced of all of these things, and she could be very, very difficult to live with. So I continued to pray for her, and I was the person who often was her caregiver. And one day I found that as though this dinger just descended out of the sky and hit me on the head, and I stopped feeling mad at her. I stopped blaming her for everything. And it was just really kind of this magical spiritual thing. I just stopped feeling that. And that may be one of the greatest gifts I got in my whole life. And after that, I was able to be of service to her. She still drove me crazy, mind you. I mean, and even thinking about her now, I can still get worked up about her. But, I was able to gain some perspective on her, and I was able to really take into account things that I learned about her, think horrible things that had happened to her. And I had a fellowship looking into trauma and the way that we respond to trauma. And I also learned about the ACEs score. I don't know if people have heard about that. It's the Adverse Childhood Experience score. It was done by this big healthcare provider. Permanente, I think. Anyway, my mom's adverse childhood experience score was like off the hook, high, and I began to see no wonder why she was behaved in this way. And there was certainly no means for her to address it in those days. She didn't talk to anybody about it. I was the closest she ever got to, just at least, airing it out a little bit. And so I was able to stop arguing with her. I stopped having to correct her. I stopped having to be right. I would, for instance, she got in a terrible car wreck, and she didn't want to go to the doctor afterwards for her follow-up. And so I just made an appointment, and I took her. And she was mad. She says, I don't like people making these appointments without my input. And, she's just she would have this little way, she was a little tiny person, and she would sort of screw herself up and just become very indignant. And, I just said, well, I know, I bet it's very frustrating. But do you remember when you and Seal, your sister, used to go up to Sister Bay and pick cherries? And she would say, oh, yeah, that was really nice. I just gave up having to convince her of anything. I would just divert her, and was able to, as I said, be of service to her. And that was a tremendous gift, that was given to me, I think, by a number of things, the prayer, sobriety, and my research. And when she passed, I didn't have any woulda, coulda, shouldas about that old woman. I mean, it was harder than I thought it would be. It's always harder. Nothing is ever all sewed up, I often think this current focus we have on data is just people's desperate urge to avoid death and to figure out if we can just nail all this down, we'll all be all right and we'll figure it all out. Well, you can never figure it all out, and it's never totally rational. But it was still hard. But when she left, I felt as though my side of the street, as they say, was clean. And I don't know if you remember nothing else from this talk I'm giving today. In your own life, I would encourage that to be the thing that you take home. And that's, I think, the message that one can get from medicine, the universal message. All of us family, in our families, what is it, Tolstoy who said that all families are unhappy in their own unique way. All of us have some struggles with our family of origin, the people that raised us, and, in which there's a great deal of shame and blame, I think, to some degree. And I think that that's a universal message that people might be able to take from this book. I've been giving the sign, so we're going to edge towards questions, I think.
I have one more question.
Yes.
How did it happen that you made a jingle dress?
Yeah, I don't know. I was just messing around with the sewing machine, and I'm not much of a seamstress, and I just was sewing over there, and I was watching old movies. My mother and I love to watch old movies, so I'd stream old movies while I was sewing, and I realized I was making a jingle dress. And I'm not a big dancer, I'm not a big powwow person, but I just sort of realized I was doing it. And I often have a lot of ideas about the way things should be and the outcomes and so on. But I think, the process of doing the research for this book and my sobriety and so on, has kind of given me a little bit of a gift to be able to just kind of just surrender to the powers that be. I was supposed to be making this dress, man. So I just kept making it. And I got the cones, and I applied them, and the cones, we put usually 365 cones on for each day of the year. And, I made the dress, and I wore it, and I danced up in Bad River, O'Dane at our powwow. And as I mentioned in the book, my old knees, you're supposed to be traditionally, the woman dances with spring-like steps. And my knees wouldn't allow me to be so spring-like. But I danced, and I danced in the very place, where you could see the school is gone, it's been torn down, but then the foundation was still visible. So within sight of where my mother had gone to school, I was able to dance this jingle dress, which is considered a healing dance. And this is something she never could have dreamt of. So this book and the research for this book has afforded me just these incredible opportunities to, I hate using some of these words, healing, because it's so overused and doesn't have as much meaning, but I don't know, it made me feel so much better and so much more present than I've ever felt before.
And that was near the same time you also received your Indian name, right? Or was it earlier
I had
or
gotten
later?
it quite a bit earlier.
Earlier.
But, yeah.
How about, did your mother and grandmother have Indian names?
You know, my mom had one, but she said they made her forget it. But there was an elder in our lodge who said that the name that they give for those people is Zagima, which means child of love. So that's always the name I think of her as, is having is child of love.
Oh, that's beautiful. Because I'm thinking, so many people of my generation and my mother's generation, but the boarding school generations did not have, never received Indian names.
Yeah.
And they never danced. They knew of dancing, but they never danced. So I think when I finished my research, I end my my dissertation with saying, before I started this journey, I did not know one Indian word, and I'm like from 6 different tribes. So that's total erasure of culture, music, dance, language, and so it's just so amazing that now we have people like you writing, and has so much going on in terms of culture and in the U.S. and Canada.
Well, and that people kept it alive.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Secretly.
that they were strong enough to keep it alive. That was the resilience, and that we have enough, that we have people who are still, can speak their language fluently. Well, I think we're supposed to take questions now, so we want to.
We have time for a couple of questions.
We
If
have
you
a
have
time?
one, please come down and ask
Oh,
it
she
at
has
the
the
mic.
microphone
And we'll
there.
start with a question from one of our virtual viewers here. And they say, I'm interested in the fact that you're a journalist, but this book is so personal to your story. If you wrote a second book, would it also be a more personal story?
I am writing a second book. I signed a 2-book contract, and my next book is on missing and murdered. And we thought about, doing a personal through line, but I'm not going to do it this time. I'm actually going to do, these cold case crimes are so popular, and I have a fantastic one that's going to be my through line. So, but it's going to be very personal for them, certainly, and I might introduce my own experiences as well.
Thank you so much. Like, this has been really insightful. My name is Philippe. I'm a student over at Roosevelt University. Well, I can relate to a lot of it. I'm sure everybody can, because, secularization happens across all cultures, and with natives, that's, to me, I look at things in shifts. So, like, that's like the previous generation shift that happened across all the Americas. It wasn't just tied to one race. So it's listening to you talk. It's like whenever secularization happens, like for us, like, I'm Haitian, it's a lot of people, they can't, they don't even speak French, you know what I'm saying? So how are they going to learn English? You know what I'm saying? That's a whole different time period. It's a whole different culture change. So it's just being mindful and like hearing both you guys put in perspective. Both you ladies put in perspective was awesome. But I just wanted to ask, like, how much time did it take for you to be able to like put everything together, and like when did you feel that confidence to be able to share your story as well? And thank you.
Thank you. Well, I've been writing it for a really long time. I actually started writing in the 80s, and over the years, I worked at newspapers for a while, so I was a full-time employee, and then I wanted to write about Native people, so I went off on my own, and I occasionally would, because I wrote many stories about boarding schools, and I would get nibbles occasionally from publishers or agents, about writing about the boarding schools, but it was always sort of, well, we already got an Indian writer, or we already got a boarding school book, and I was trying to make a living. I would give some time to it, but there really wasn't a lot of interest. But, things came together in the news cycle, as I kind of call it, these things we see, we know they've been going, the people who are affected, we know this stuff has been going on for generations, but the world at large, white people, if you will, to say it, they'll decide they know about it, they want to know about it, and all this business up in Canada where they started talking about finding the graves, even though, of course, we all knew there were graves at boarding schools because we knew kids died there, and so we knew they buried them, but it created this flashpoint, I think, in the news cycle, and I was well situated. David Schroyer, who, you know, my forever have a great debt to him. He's Leech Laker, and he's an editor, and he's a writer, but he got hired as editor at Pantheon Books, and so he said, you know, I think we should really work on this together. So he helped me, and we created a proposal, and doggone if they didn't hire me to do this. So, you know, it took me really to you know, from that point of, you know, I had like years of research and writing. It took me like about a year and a half to write it.
Thank you so much. You're awesome.
Thanks.
I'm very curious about the return to the culture, bringing back the religion, the dancing, I've noticed last year at the Newberry Library they had dancing, some Indian tribe dancing, and I wonder what's the sense of bringing back the culture that we have not seen. The dancing and the tradition.
I'm not really sure what your question is. You mean the importance of that?
Well, no. Is it returning to the importance to people of the dancing and the culture of the, you know, like at the Newberry Library they had the native dancing, and is that becoming more prevalent?
Oh, yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah, people are embracing it, and there's a lot of support in communities, and up until our recent presidential election, there was actually a lot of federal dollars to support, you know, language and, food sovereignty, returning to traditional foods, and many of these traditional activities. So, yeah, I think people come to see that, you know, being who you are is tremendously life-affirming.
Also, I don't know if we mentioned it, but our celebrating our cultures, our languages, our spirituality was outlawed. There were actually laws passed in the United States. In fact, the last religion, Native American Church, was not approved until 1993. That's not that long ago.
Yeah.
And then the blossoming of Native dance, music and dance, theater, filmmaking, writing, has just really just blossomed so much, and I'd say the last 40 years. The last 20 really is just expanded incredibly. But that's all because the dancing for sure was just a result of it being outlawed, so that people were not doing it, they didn't know it, and then of the growth of powwow, which is not, for most tribes is not traditional, but it does have elements of the different the tribes where the powwows take place. So that's one. That was our dance company in Chicago, the Black Hawk Performance Company. We even have one of our dancers in the audience. I know she probably doesn't want me to call her out, but so that's something that's a way that's the way in which we pass on culture and language and music. Through all of that is through the elders and the youth working together in doing dance.
So you're bringing it's increasing the
Oh yes.
the prevalence.
Oh yes.
And the identification.
Yes. Yes.
Well, you know, we look at what I mentioned, the Code of Indian Offenses. That was, you know, the dancing, you know, white folks were really scared of us dancing, particularly during, you know, the ghost dance days. They were afraid that we'd, you know, get ourselves worked up and kill white people. So, you know, all of that went underground. And certainly in little communities like Bad River, you know, you can see, if you look at some of the historical photos in which they were doing these like presentations for, you know, for the school or for these, like they would do these Indian pageants, they're dressed in traditional clothing. They're like, you know, in plain sight, under their noses, they were actually passing on songs. So people did do their traditional ways, and they're really, to me, the really inspiring thing is even the staunchest church lady among the, you know, the people on the reservation, they didn't report them because they wanted to keep those things going.
Thank you.
Well, also sometime in the boarding schools dressed up the students and took them out to dance to make money for the schools. So here, though American Indian dance was outlawed on the reservations, and the Indian people were not supposed to do it, the nuns had them do it for money. So that, I just can't wrap my mind around how that could make any sense, but it was a way the nuns saw that they could make money by saying, here are these poor, dirty children? Will you help them, give them some money?
And the thing that always amazes me, these were people who lived, for instance, like at St. Mary's School in Odana. My gosh, they lived there among those people from the 1880s onwards, yet managed to learn almost nothing about the population. They created a Catholic world in miniature, and they really didn't leave very often. The priests would go out sometimes, but I always think there's a very interesting book to be done about these nuns. What a bizarre life these women would come from, often from Europe. These are not wealthy women, these are, probably women, poor women, and this is maybe the only alternative for them. And they would, English was a second language. They would come by ship, and then they would take a train, and then they would ride it, a horse-drawn wagon out into the middle of, nowhere, essentially, out to these prairies. And they were servants, for the priests, and they just remained locked up with those children 24/7. It was not a good situation, It was really very unhealthy, I think, mentally.
Thank you again. This is a final question. I just kind of found it cool because, not cool, it's actually really messed up. But there's like a polarity of both sides. It's like being able to, hopefully there's some way you could study the psychology of, let's just say the nuns and even like the Indians, for example, because it seems like, well, one side has to be like, this one psychology has to be like super profit based. I mean, if you are trying to, I guess, cleanse a culture and religion and replace it with like a fancy word like agency or like, you know what I'm saying, like that. It's like, well, or also you're trying to like keep things back and like keep it rare at the same time. I mean, that takes quite a bit amount of effort, just as much as it does to learning a new language takes way less effort than that. But then the psychologies behind these two, I feel like should be studied. Do you think it would be possible, or are there any are there any books or any references to be able to distinguish these two ways of thinking?
Yeah, there have been a lot of other boarding school books written by Native people and non-Native people. There's a really excellent book by Adams, which is Education for Extinction. Brenda Child wrote Boarding School Seasons. Oh God, there's just so many. Of course, Denise Ladjmedier, Stringing Rosaries, a more recent one. Gosh, and I'm kind of put me on the spot. I can't think immediately of a big list, but there are a number. Reservation Blues. There are a number of books, but one has to look for them. It's just only recently that there has been a market for them, if you will.
But that's a good point, because that's why psychology hasn't really moved that much in terms of our people, because people haven't studied it and really have not really written any theories and practicing. They're out there practicing as mental health workers, but they really haven't studied the causes of our issues and the foundation, which is tribal, and then we have this mix of forced Christianization over those periods of time. So in fact, my daughter wants to be a counselor, and I've told her, well, I don't know how you're going to study, what kind of psychology you're going to study if you're going to study Native people. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to do because it's not there. Foundation's not there.
The data's not, okay, so if you're a tribal people, right, and then you're completely different races, first of all, you're in two different environments, and then you're also developing in different locations. So then whenever you decide to trade with these people, right, you have to open up enough to understand what you're buying and selling. And then you have to figure out how to profit in your own sort of way. So that is absolutely untrue. You have to learn about it, and then you have to learn how you could profit from it.
Well, read about the trading in the Midwest. That's our people were the great traders of the Midwest. The trade, so that's something you can look at, is that all the people that were involved in trading, right, Mary?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have time for one final question.
Hi, I just want to say thanks for everything. A lot of what you said resonated with me. My family back in the day was from the St. Regis in New York, if you all are familiar. I remember what you were saying about the doctors and stuff, and there's this story. My grandfather one time, I guess he threw a punch at a paramedic, was trying to take him to the hospital. But my question is, just lots of random little things just resonated, and I want to know, what do you think it was with collecting those state quarters?
Oh, my mom.
Why do you think
Why did
people
she
like
do
that so much.
Why
yeah.
did she do that? Well, you know, she was
Because
really
my grandpa and them, same thing.
Well, I think it is some of it is, you know, perhaps the time, you know, the milieu, and I think yes, having people were great collectors, and to have each quarter for the state. I think somehow she probably fell prey to the marketing that, you know, you would have if you had each of those quarters, they might actually be worth something. But I think they were worth 25 cents, you know, each of them. But
Today they would be worth more.
maybe they would be. Yeah, could be. Yeah, but she was often a great collector, yeah, of stuff.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but please join me at one more round of applause for Mary and Doreen. And before we go, I just want to ask Doreen, give a little shout out for the dance troupe and all of the work that you're doing here if people want to see you.
Okay, I'm located here in Chicago. I'm with the American Indian Association of Illinois, and we have Black Hawk